Swordpoint, mass battle rule sets for the ancient and medieval period. Can you just tell us what period that is exactly?
But it will eventually operate from ancient Sumeria right through to about 1530. The core set, which the early sets of lists were before, is the classical and the Dark Age period, so about 500 BC to about 1100 AD.
Okay, so as I just said, it is mass battles. We're talking about what, 6x4 tables ideally, and how many sort of figures are we looking at?
We're putting on 6x4 tables because that's the size that most people can manage at home or at their club. It'll play on a bigger table. I wouldn't play on a smaller table, to be honest. The army sizes will depend really upon the quality of the troops, but we're talking about between 150 and 350 figures altogether, I would say.
Okay, are points a big issue in the games? Everything very points based?
We've got a point system in order to generate lists and attempt to make them as fair as possible, yes.
Okay, and kind of away from perhaps what we'd associate with Griffin Beast, a more sort of skirmish saga approach, we're figures on multi-bases, yeah?
Yeah, we're using figures on multiple bases and a number of bases making up a unit, anything from about 4 to 12 depending on the types of troops.
Okay. What kind of generically sort of game are we talking about? Is it buckets of dice game? Is it a D6 kind of game? Is it a game with a lot of movement involved?
Yeah, yes and no. It uses certainly uses D6 and nothing else, but people are unlikely to be throwing more than about 6 of them at a time. So far fewer than some other games. Certainly not a buckets of dice game. A several dice game, not a bucket of dice game.
What sort of things was your prime ideas when you were creating the rules? What did you really want to get across in this set of rules?
I think when anyone sets out to write rules, they do it because their view of what a battle looks like is going to be slightly different from anybody else's, and if they haven't bought into somebody else's vision, or the vision they were adhering to is now no longer played, it's not fashionable anymore, then you need an alternative. And so I think what I've tried to do is write something which shows my vision, if you like, of what a battle in the period should look like. So it differs from others in hopefully quite subtle ways. Tried to get armies to operate as armies, not as little individual units which zoom off around the battlefield by themselves. So there's an emphasis on coordinating the troops to operate together, keeping a battle line going, rather than just creating super units which can be used to go around beating up on the opponents.
Is that historical accuracy very important?
I don't think a war game can actually be historically accurate, not conclusively anyway. There's always a balance to be struck between what works well in a game and gives a good time to the players and what is historically accurate. Nobody would buy a rule set which allowed one particular army to ride roughshod over all the others, for example, even though it might have done so in its own period of history. Everyone has to have a chance of some degree, so you have to balance the two. So what we've tried to do is, generally speaking, anything that happens should feel realistic, given what anyone's individual idea of realism is for something that happened 2,000 years ago. We hope that there won't be anything that people look at and say, well, that's just completely ridiculous and couldn't happen. But there will be occasions where something will be slightly stylized, for example, and we are looking at, this is a game where the general is looking at the entire battlefield, and not focusing in on what's happening in the front row of this unit to the nth degree, which can sometimes happen. So there's a compromise. We weren't keen on the kind of game where amorphous blobs line up and each side throws one dice and that's the end of that. That's just too zoomed out. But equally, we've tried not to have too many modifiers which have to be looked at on a chart every single time in order to work out what on earth is happening in this combat. there's always some modifiers in any game which have to be applied. But we've tried to make them fairly easy to pick up. And when people have been trying the game out at demos we've done at some shows, they've got the hang of it in a couple of minutes, which I think is a reasonable test.
What to you is the most interesting or enjoyable aspect of the rules that you've written? Which bit do you like playing the most and going, yeah, that really works well, or I think that's good?
I like what happens when you use an army which resembles its historical prototype, and you use it in the way that its prototype would have operated, and it works in the game. And that, to me, is the most important thing. And I think we've got that.
Okay, right, good. Thanks very much, Martin.
Thank you.